MIT. Before going back to MIT, he was senior political scientist at the RAND Corporation, in which he led a variety of very important projects on China, Japan, and regional security issues. And he was the lead author of two recent RAND reports, one China's Evolving Nuclear Deterrent, and the other one, the frequently cited study, U.S.-China Military Scorecard. Dr. Hogenbotham is not only a specialist of Chinese military affairs, but also Japanese military strategy. He is fluent in both Chinese and Japanese, and his English is very good as well. And he's someone that I always turn to for expertise on East Asian security issues and military strategy. Dr. Hogenbotham.
Thanks very much for that kind introduction, Mike. Honored to be here amongst so many august people, and I know I, for one, have learned a lot today. I absolutely appreciate all of the problems and challenges that the bases in Okinawa pose to the people there and to the politics. I was assigned, though, the task of talking about strategic issues, and so I'll stick to that fairly narrowly. I'll just make four basic points on the security equation, and we can follow up on those during the equation and during the discussion, and maybe bring these various strands together. But the first point I'd make is that Japan's security situation is arguably more challenging than at any point during the post-World War II period. Second point is that Okinawa is more relevant to many of those challenges than it was to the defense of Japan during the Cold War or the defense of other areas in East Asia. Third, it will likely be necessary, as Professor Nozoe suggested, for the alliance to reconsider its military strategy in light of evolving military technologies, and we see that to a certain extent that's already happening. And fourth, the adjustments to strategy will have implications for the nature, location, and size of the military presence on Okinawa. And I'll focus my comments on China. I'm quite pleased that Dr. Perry addressed the Korea aspects of the challenge, or the regional environment, in such detail. Before diving into those points, though, I just want to stipulate up front that neither China nor Japan, in my view, would ever deliberately start a war with each other, nor with the United States. So on that point, I'm fully in agreement with Dr. Perry and most sinologists. But there is the possibility that a clash could occur, and that neither side would find it easy to retreat from their positions. In that context, then, the military balance may influence the extent to which the various actors might accept risk, both before and during and after a clash. So I'm going to talk about military operations around Okinawa, but again, I want to stress that that's not the expected outcome. On my first point, the balance of power in the Asia-Pacific region is shifting with dramatic speed. Growth in Chinese military spending has tracked closely with the growth of the Chinese economy. Since 1996, when we had the Taiwan Straits crisis, and also when the SACO agreement was finalized, Chinese military spending has grown by an inflation-adjusted average of 10% per year or thereabouts. That slowed down somewhat in recent years, but another 8% increase was approved this month. So in aggregate, China's defense budget has grown by an inflation-adjusted 720% since 1996, so we're really in a different kind of world than we were when the Taiwan Straits crisis happened. We've heard a fair bit in recent years and months about the fact that Japanese military spending is now beginning to grow again. The cabinet approved a 1.3% increase in the self-defense budget in December, but again, we need to keep this in perspective. In 1996, Japan's defense budget was about twice that of China. Today, it's significantly less than a third. It's going on about a quarter of China's defense spending. Now, spending, of course, is only the inputs. What are the outputs? China's military capabilities don't yet reflect the full scope of its expenditures. Weapon stocks take years and decades to develop, and Japan continues to maintain a lead in a number of areas. It has some of the best warships, it has the best navy in the region. But again, the trend lines are quite clear. China already has advantages in some areas, and more types of equipment are reaching series production and being pumped out of Chinese factories. So just to review the bidding in some of these areas, China today has more than 1,300 very accurate conventionally armed ballistic missiles. Some of those now have the range to reach Guam. It has an unknown but probably equal number of long-range cruise missiles. The missiles are part of what people have termed an anti-access area denial capability, but China is also no longer really a one-trick pony, and it's developed quite a force of conventional maneuver forces as well. It operates about 850 modern fourth-generation fighters, and that's against roughly 300 fourth-generation fighters that Japan operates. And its Navy, which was once a primarily frigate force, is now in series production of destroyers. It's going to commission 5 new large destroyers this year, which is a faster rate of production than the United States is pursuing. Okay, turning to my second major point, Okinawa is now central to the military equation in East Asia. And we could talk about its proximity to various potential conflict points. I'll just talk about its immediate relevancy to a Senkaku Islands clash or dispute, but the same things could be said with regard to its proximity to Taiwan, which is not far from the Senkakus. Naha, Kadena, and Futenma are the only 3 U.S. and Japanese air bases within unrefueled fighter range of the Senkakus. Unrefueled fighter range is about 1,000 kilometers. And the distance from Okinawa to the Senkakus, or the main Okinawan island to the Senkakus, is just over 400 kilometers. In contrast, China has about 29 military air bases within unrefueled range of that area, so it can, at least in principle, get more aircraft there, and its response times could be shorter. U.S. and Japanese aircraft can, of course, use tankers to fly from more distant areas, but again, transit times would be longer and response times slower. Some of these bases, like Yokota, are more than 2,000 kilometers from the Senkakus. All right, on my third point, it's increasingly necessary for the United States and Japan to adjust military strategy, and again, we see some indications of this. In my own view, a strong case could be made for transitioning to what might be called a denial strategy, a more defensive strategy, which would take greater advantage of distance, time, mobility, and the inherent advantages of defense. Not only would this be, I think, a more robust defense and a more affordable defense, but also this would buttress, I think, crisis stability as well. I won't get into the finer points of that debate over strategy, but I do want to stress that most, or at least many military analysts now agree on at least some of the adjustments that will be necessary. In response to the vulnerability of bases and other fixed assets, the Alliance is looking to improve what military officers call operational resilience. Operational resilience is the ability of a force to sustain attack and continue to function effectively, and it can be achieved through a variety of measures: active defenses, hardening, dispersion, and mobility. Active defense would include air and missile defenses, these SAM batteries, surface-to-air missile batteries, and missile defense batteries. And this is probably what most people think of when they imagine a response to the missile threat. But missile defenses, unfortunately, are extraordinarily expensive, probably more expensive than the missiles they're designed to shoot down, and they're not always terribly effective. So they're certainly not the only answer. The hardening of bases involves the construction of concrete shelters for aircraft and the protection of critical stores like fuel, munitions, and command facilities, etc. The dispersion of forces is also critical. Aircraft, for example, can be dispersed within an air base if there's sufficient space for that and if there are few enough aircraft on the base. They can also be dispersed to a larger number of air bases and runways within the Japanese archipelago, assuming they have access to those air bases or airstrips, and these could of course include civilian dual-use facilities. Dispersion could also see forces deployed at greater distances from China. For example, they might be deployed to Guam or other islands in the Marianas at the outset of a conflict and then perhaps move back in. And then finally, mobility, concealment, and deception may also be elements of operational resiliency. And we see a bunch of new concepts being explored by, for example, the US Air Force, which in many ways is really taking a page from the Marines playbook. But there's a new concept that the Air Force calls ACE, Agile Combat Employment, and they're experimenting with taking small groups of aircraft, 4 fighters and 1 C-17 to austere bases, operating for 24 or 36 hours, and then coming back to a main operating base. Okay, finally, I'll turn to the issue of what the implications are for US and Japanese military presence in Okinawa. And the question here is, does all of this mean that bases are less important, they're more vulnerable, so does this mean we should be pulling out of Okinawa? And my short answer is no, but my longer answer is, adjustments are certainly in order. So in my view, the ideal adjustments, and again, these are only my own views of this, but in my view, 3 adjustments might be in order. First, air and air defense and missile defense components should in fact be reinforced through the UQs. The self-defense forces have already done some of this. The SDF has moved a small battery of surface-to-air missiles and anti-ship missiles, 1 battery of each, to each of 3 different islands, Amami Oshima, which is just off Kyushu, Kagoshima, Miyako Island, which is just south of the island of Okinawa, and Ishigaki, which is down at the end of the island chain near Taiwan. It's also placed a radar on Yonaguni, which is really at the tip, just off of Taiwan. And it's increased its air presence at Naha from 1 fighter squadron to 2, bringing the total number of fighters to 40. Some additional deployments may be in order. They're talking about bringing anti-ship missiles to the main island of Okinawa. And if one thinks about it, should a conflict occur, and what we're really looking at here is the ability to deter such conflict, but should a conflict occur, 3 batteries of anti-ship missiles and 3 batteries of anti-aircraft missiles are unlikely to do the trick. But forces can be flown into the theater, and my recommendation or my thought about a second adjustment would be the further improvement of military infrastructure so that, if some incident should occur, forces can flow into the theater. And again, we see some of this already going on. In an ideal world, there would be more operating locations for aircraft. So there would be dual-use airports open, perhaps in Miyako or Ishigaki. So there would be more locations from which aircraft could operate. To be sure, in an air and missile scenario, bases throughout Japan would be vulnerable to missile attack, but Chinese missile numbers and capabilities are not unlimited. So the more of these bases that you have available to you and the more of these bases that you can operate from, the harder it would be for China or an adversary to shut them down, and the less incentive an adversary would have to try. Bases would be hardened, and harbor and communication infrastructure throughout the review queues, again, would be further improved. And again, we see a lot of this going on. And then finally, the military forces capable of movement, capable of actually executing this kind of shift down into the review queues would be enhanced. Again, all 3 of these we see happening to some extent. After decades of ever-increasing ship sizes, Japan for the first time is downsizing its next tranche of ships, and they're producing 8 destroyers that are more like frigate-class size and can operate from some of the harbors in the Ryukyu chain. Air packages could be made more expeditionary. Japan is studying the acquisition of F-35B fighters. That's the short takeoff and vertical landing variant of the F-35. And these could be deployed on the Osumi-class ships, but also on the islands themselves on shorter, more austere runways. So in conclusion, I'd say that from a defense perspective, Okinawa is more important than ever. Units there no longer are simply marking time or stationed there for more distant contingencies, or at least that's not their only function. They contribute directly to the immediate defense of Okinawa. From Okinawa's perspective, this is, maybe unfortunate. If it's any consolation, diplomacy and deterrence worked during the Cold War when West Germany and Hokkaido were on the front line. And with some creative thinking, there's no reason to think this won't work today in East Asia, where the situation is far less dire than it ever was during the Cold War. Thanks.
Thank you very much. So before